another video here. I thought a good place to start, as this is a fairly new channel, we would do Genesis 1:1, just kind of start from the beginning. Especially since Genesis 1:1 is actually a good subject. It has some nuances and differences of view that different scholars and believers have. And so that is the verse, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. All right. So if you've grown up in Christianity, typically that's the belief kind of where ex nihilo comes from, creation out of nothing, because in the beginning, in the absolute sense, in the Christian framework, God exists outside of time. And, well, excuse me, I'm going to say modern Christian framework, just because I think there's a lot of nuances there that need to be taken into account, but that it exists outside of time, okay? And that concept developed from Greco-Roman philosophies and thoughts. And it does say that in the Hebrew Bible, okay? And it can even be read that way. It's not to say that it's incorrect, but scholars are realizing there's actually some other ways that it can be read, and surprisingly, scholars more and more actually have been leaning in that direction. And as far as I understand, someone can correct me if I'm wrong, the majority consensus on scholarship is that the translation is not in the beginning in the absolute sense, but rather we're talking about in the beginning of God simply creating the earth, okay? And we're going to talk about that. Okay, so before getting too much into it, I want to reiterate kind of the purpose of this channel, where it's okay to ask difficult questions, to be wrong about things. I think as religious people like myself, we too often just double down with the dogma and the system of belief that we have, and I think and fully believe that that deprives us of opportunities to learn what the authors were originally intending. So if science or more understanding contradicts what we've traditionally understood, we should at least ask the question and accept the fact that we might be wrong. And 9 times out of 10, I think that helps us come closer to a correct exegesis of the text and what the author was originally intending to say, which ultimately, in my view, helps us get closer to God. So with the subject. So in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. That's the text that I think most of us are probably familiar with. It's a complete sentence. It sounds like it's the first thing that's happening as everything is created, okay? Outside of time, then time and everything within it is created, okay? And then verse 2 kind of tells us that the earth was formless and void. Darkness covered the face of the deep. The Spirit of God hovers over the waters. That's kind of been the traditional understanding of the text. But it's not the only possible way to read it. And from what I understand, most biblical scholars actually understand that a better rendition would be something along the lines of not in the beginning, but rather simply when God began creating the heavens and the earth. And that's actually the rendition in the NRSV version of the Bible now. So when God began creating, not in the beginning, simply when God began creating the heavens and the earth. Or another slightly different rendition of that is that does include beginning, would be in a beginning God began creating the heavens and the earth. So there's a difference between that. All right. So instead of describing the first event that happens in verse 1 becomes more of an introduction to everything that follows. And then the story begins with verse 2. All right. So the earth is already described as being formless and void. Okay. Darkness covers the deep waters. And then finally in verse 3, we get God speaking, let there be light. All right. So the issue on how these different understandings of how we might be reading these texts, from what I understand, comes down to the first word in the text, Bereshit. It's the very first word of the Bible, okay? And traditionally, that does mean in the beginning, okay? But Hebrew grammar, when we're looking at grammar, it becomes more complicated, okay? So A lot of scholars will point out that Bereshit is in a construct state. So it's not in the beginning in a timeless sense, but rather in the beginning of something happening. So we actually see this elsewhere in the Bible with like the reign of the king, like at the beginning of the reign of, okay? Or for example, I come home from work at the beginning of my time when I'm home with my kids, okay? It's not in the absolute timeless sense beginning, it's just the beginning of something, in this case, in the beginning of God creating the heavens and the earth, okay? So it's introducing what's coming up next, okay? So this, lost my train of thought. Okay, so back on it. One book that I do want to recommend if you really want to dig into this is Mark S. Smith's book, Genesis. Actually, I don't think it's called Genesis. It's just called, that's right, The Priestly Vision of Genesis 1. That's it. All right, yes, The Priestly Vision of Genesis 1. All right. It's not a terribly long read. I really love Mark S. Smith's work because he's actually a believer, but he's also very scholarly. He understands these things. And for me, he's helped me navigate a lot of these things. So I would recommend that book if you really want to kind of dig into questions like this. All right. And he does agree that ultimately what we're looking at in the text is not in the beginning in a timeless sense, but rather in the beginning of God creating the heavens and the earth. Okay. Is that a big deal? I guess that depends upon you and your views on things. Okay. For me, it matters because it kind of changes the questions that Genesis is trying to answer. Okay. So we tend to read Genesis as like the creation of material origins of the universe. Where did matter come from? Even things like how old is the earth? Okay. But questions like that, they're kind of they would be anachronistic. Well, I should say it's argued by a lot of scholars that that type of thinking is anachronistic to ancient Near Eastern culture. It didn't really view things in the matter of a physical sense when it came to existence, but rather function, the purposes that it serves. Okay, and we actually see this in the text itself, and that's why a lot of scholars will argue this. So God, if you'll actually read Genesis chapter 1, almost all of it, it's not saying that God creates. It's saying like God separates the waters above from the waters below. He separates the light from the darkness. He separates the seas from the dry lands. He fills the seas with fish and the skies with the fowls of the air. Okay. So he's creating, organizing, assigning functions. Okay. There's not really an emphasis on like a composition of matter. So it's on God's sovereign order of creation. And we actually see a lot of this when we look at other ancient Near Eastern texts. So it fits within the cultural river, if you will. All right. Genesis does stand out from other creation accounts of ancient Near Eastern culture in some fascinating ways that do make it unique still. So in ancient Near Eastern culture, when we have stories of creation, there's usually like a cosmic struggle or a battle between the gods and the lower gods, or like there's some type of fight that happens, and that ultimately causes the creation. Whereas with Genesis, we're dealing with the one true God, okay, nobody else. He speaks and things come into existence. He is sovereign over all. In fact, what's interesting is that it's kind of a side rail subject here. A lot of scholars think that when God creates the sun and the moon, as he's referring to God creating them, and the sun and the moon are just referred to, just heavenly lights, that's actually a polemic or an attack against other religion wouldn't be the correct term in this context, but how they viewed their reality with the nature of gods and humans and everything like that. Because to them, the sun was a god and the moon was a god. So a lot of people believe that by Genesis attributing like the moon and the sun being created as a single, like just speaking the word, that's like an attack on their view. Like obviously, Elohim is much greater. Okay. So I thought interesting sidetrack, not really pertinent to this, but it just came to my mind. Okay. So does this mean that Genesis actually rejects the idea of ex nihilo? Now, I'm LDS, so I do not believe in ex nihilo, but I also believe in being academic to the best of my ability and being intellectually honest. No, it doesn't definitively rule out ex nihilo just by looking at that text itself. Okay, it could. But when you really get into exegesis and trying to understand how they viewed cosmology and how things worked, I do agree with what seems to me to be the majority of academic biblical scholarship, that we're not talking about in the beginning in a timeless sense. So those that do believe in creation ex nihilo, typically what they'll argue is, and you can make this argument, is that Genesis 1 is not saying creation out of nothing and then, from the very beginning of all time. It is talking about in the beginning of creating the earth and the heavens. But that before the creation of the earth, at some point in the past, God created time and everything like that. Okay, so you could adopt that belief. It doesn't 100% say that that's not true. I don't believe that that's true in the literal sense, but I'm just going to throw that out there just for the sake of intellectual honesty. Okay. What was I going to say? All right. So whether it's translated as in the beginning God created, or like in a beginning, or when God began creating, the ultimate theological message of Genesis is what's important. It's the thing that does tend, in my mind, to be consistent, and that is that the God of Israel is the sovereign creator. He orders the cosmos. He prepares it to become a dwelling place, that he dwells within the cosmos with humanity. So maybe that's kind of a good point to kind of wrap this up with things like this. So a lot of times people feel like the scholarship could inadvertently weaken our faith, or people feel like they're attacks on the Bible. I think people, especially from more my culture and background, that are extremely religious, would be surprised at the number of biblical scholars that actually are firm believing scholars. And we need to be able to ask these questions and be okay with being wrong, and to investigate them further, because it could actually help us understand better exegesis and what the text is actually trying to tell us. So I think I'm going to end that there. I can't think of anything else to say on that. But if you enjoyed the discussion, please consider subscribing to my channel. I'm going to hopefully try and make this better. I'm just starting. I don't know what I'm doing, to be honest. I know I need things like lighting and better video work. So hopefully that's coming. If you're interested in viewing the Bible through more of an academic lens and how to navigate faith along with that, please subscribe to my channel, and thank you so much.